Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm rather hoping to read out a bit from the CV that said I was in the Met. That generally tends to put people off as I start a conversation with anybody else in the country. So, ladies and gents, we've talked a lot this morning and this afternoon about learning and development and the space for policing. This morning, I was really struck by some of the opening remarks. So there were three questions that were sort of posed. Something about learning and development being novel, being innovative, and a blend of academia and policing. And Rachel this morning, the ACC, said, so what is the model for police training? How do we meet the needs of the service, the public, and the people? What organisational conditions do we need to create a learning organisation? Hopefully, I'm going to give you some idea of what we think the answers to some of those questions are. It's for you to judge whether we're close, not close, etc. So, we saw this quote earlier today. This is from Vision 2025, and it effectively sets a challenge not only for policing, but for police learning and development. Because to deliver that, fundamentally, learning and development in policing has to do something radically different to what it's done previously. So, one of the challenges is, it's not clear what 2025 looks like. So, I'm going to get you to do a very quick exercise on your tables, and I'd like you to take no more, this is 2 minutes, I'd like you to take 1 minute to think about those two questions. So what will the policing landscape look like in 2025, and how can we measure it? And how do we measure what we do when we get there? So, how do we think about getting to 2025 and beyond? So the challenges are, so the first thing is, we have no idea what that landscape looks like. It's terra incognita in the old map makers' terms. We don't know, there are dragons somewhere in there, but we don't know where they are. We also don't know how the landscape moves around us. So the picture there is of a polar explorer, and there's a peculiarity of polar exploration that when you pitch your tent, you're on pack ice. So you pitch your tent, and overnight the pack ice moves. If you're really lucky, it's moved towards the pole. If you're really unlucky, it's moved away from the pole, and you have to make up that ground the next day. We don't know what the shifting landscape of our world will look like. Importantly also, even if we did know where it was, everybody starts from a different place potentially. And we've heard a lot of variation in the conversations about where policing is today. And there may be different routes, different journeys. And if you've got different routes, different starting points and different journeys, you're almost certainly going to need different sorts of tools, techniques and capabilities to get you there. So an ice axe is great on an ice floe, not so great if you're walking up the path on the side of Helvellyn. So you need to think about, you need to understand all of those things. And lastly, the great sage Pooh Bear made this point. Even if you do not think you're lost, it's possible you still are. Because even if you thought you knew where you were in this journey towards 2025, it's entirely possible that you really don't. So how do we try and solve a conundrum like that? Well, there's two things. The first is, I've outlined the problem. I asked you about measurement as well, and I'm going to divert very quickly and talk about the nature of value, which underpins the model that I'm going to discuss next. So, Arif very kindly threw in the word public value. Denise has used it, but what is public value? So, a quick refresher on what private value is. So, if you own a factory and you make widgets and you sell widgets and you make money, and that money is more than the cost of your widgets to make, your shareholders are happy, job done, thank you very much, private value. However, in the public space, it's a bit more complicated than that. So, which bit of the public who are you serving in your job in the public space? What bit of value are you trying to save? Are you talking about street lighting in poorly lit streets? Are you trying to save the bees? Are you trying to put more money into education, or into the probation service, or the hospital system? And importantly, you've also got publics, and I use the plural publics, who have different views. If you want an arch example of that, Brexit. One problem, two diametrically opposite answers to the thing, and no agreement in between particularly. And it's also entirely possible for all those different publics to hold inconsistent ideas in their head and logically think that they're consistent. So just a very quick straw poll, put your hands up if you think people who are breaking road traffic law should be stopped and in some way punished. Quick show of hands. That's some very liberal policing people in this room. Okay, so at least some of you in this room think that people who break road traffic law should be punished in some way. Question, if you were stopped, would you like that police officer to punish you, or would you like them to let you off? Quick show of hands again from those people who were in favour of crime and punishment. Okay, so, but the point is, the people who think about what creates value in public spaces do not have to be consistent. Which then leads to the challenge of there are many voices, many publics, and many asks. So how do we square that circle? So there's a definition of public value there. I don't propose to read it out. But in essence, you've got an equation with two sides to it. You've got one side, which is what does this public most value in this specific context? And that's very specifically worded, because it's this public, this context. Because it will change in different contexts and different publics. And that's what they're asking for. So that's what the public wants. The second side of that is what adds value to the public sphere. And that's the job of us as leaders in the public space to try and balance what's asked for and what actually adds value. And if you think about it, that's part of the challenge we've discussed today inside policing as well. So what is it that policing says it wants, and what do you do to give value to policing to then give external value to the public? So that's a very brief segue into public value theory. But the reason to give you this up front is because our approach and basis of thinking about where value is delivered is based in this model. Okay, so what does 2025 look like in terms of learning development? We sat down with police colleagues, and it's worth noting that this model has been derived from work between ourselves at the Open University and police colleagues initially, and then lots of discussion with police colleagues to try and refine it to make it make sense. So we sat down with the grand vision of describing what 2025 would look like for learning development. We scratched our heads for a bit and decided that was actually really very difficult. But there are two ways of describing things we discovered. The first is, if I say to you the word London, pretty much I'm sure that you will have a view about what that thing is. So you can do it, what I would describe as nominatively, by name. But the other thing you can do, so if I said there's this place with the River Thames, it's got Houses of Parliament, it's got Westminster Abbey, Tower Bridge, a big castle in the middle of it, the Gherkin and Buckingham Palace, you also get a sense of what that place is and a sense of what that location is. And of course, what we've described there is the attributes of the place, not giving it a name. And we discovered that that attributive approach was very useful in thinking about how we thought about what the space of 2025 might look like for learning and development. So we worked with colleagues and to refine a set of 9 attributes for the space in 2025. Now, don't try and read them sideways. It's a bit tricky. I will put them the right way around for you in a second. But the point is to illustrate that sense of space created through attribute. So, if I didn't pop them up in a much more readable format, these are the things that we think that space for Learning Development 2025 should look like, should have the attributes of. But importantly, we do not say how you get there or arrive at them necessarily, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. Each of those things has been selected and honed through the conversations we've had. And I think, importantly, there are some of those which are sufficiently universal that we wanted to pick them out in a particular way. So, having developed those attributes that we thought this space of 2025 might hold, we thought about what kind of a model we could build to try and describe that. I started this conversation this afternoon talking about the points that were made at the beginning, talking about about the public, talking about the people in our police forces, and talking about the organisations themselves. Well, clearly, if we're not delivering capability into organisations that delivers value for our publics, what are we doing? But also, if we're not delivering value for our individual organisations, both individually and collectively, what are we doing? And also, we talked about this learner-centric space that we've all spoken about. If none of that is doing something for the people that we want to know and learn stuff, what are we doing? And the reason they're shown there as interlinked is because they play off each other. They are not spaces which are separate from each other, and in delivering value into one, you affect value in the others. There's also the point that what you need to do is make sure that all of your activity in those spaces is underpinned by the most current, and I emphasise the word current, understanding of what is the best thing you could be doing. I don't use the word best practice because there's this vision of best practice as this monolithic thing that you can just pick up off a shelf. If we do what we're supposed to be doing right, we will continually learn and understand new things about the world and be able to understand that something new is necessary. So underpinning each of those areas is the suggestion that you would want to link them to the right areas of academic and knowledge theories. So for instance, talking about the publics, you want to talk about public value theory. Talk about organisations, organisational learning theory, and of course individuals, well, individual learning theory, of course. It's also true, and this was mentioned as well, very interestingly in some of those opening remarks, if you do none of those things and they are not underpinned by the values, ethics and mission of your organisation, why would you be doing them? So those particular attributes bind that model together. And at the very centre of all of that is learning and development. And the reason we suggest that learning and development should be at the very centre of this model is because if you think about what learning and development does and the opportunity it presents, it has your people from cradle to grave in the organisation. You tell them what to think, feel and do when they join, and you remind them what to think, feel and do throughout their journey. Irrespective of that 70-20-10 space. And actually, if you're not engineering, as we discussed earlier today, if you're not actively engineering that 70% conversational space, they're learning all the wrong things anyway. So actually, learning and development is key, not only to the 10%, not only to engineering the 20%, but also to engineering the 70% as well. So at the heart of this model, we say learning and development is the engine of change in policing organisations and the engine of delivery in policing organisations. So this slide just switches the attributes around a bit and then places them next to the model so that you can see where they fit. So some of the 9 attributes are expressly shown in this model. Some of them are implicitly shown. But the point of the model is to provide a space conceptually where you can think about how learning and development delivers into organisations. And actually it doesn't really matter whether it's policing or not, to be honest, but actually in this case it's policing. So, having discovered that there were these 9 things that we thought were absolutely the space that we wanted to describe, we thought about, okay, so what does that mean? And like any great edifice or city, you need supporting structures. You need things which have to be there to make those things possible. And so we described 17 essential criteria. And what we say is that these criteria are not the attributes of the place, but they are the things that we suggest you would want to have in place to make those attributes possible. These are short form. The document itself has in longer form the actual essential criteria, but it would make a really, really busy slide if I put them all on there. So take those as read, but there is more detail available. So, having described what we think this space looks like, and we then went on to say, so we've got criteria, we've got some essential stuff to make the criteria, the attributes happen, but there's also a load of other stuff which you really think about doing, but it's not critical to mission delivery. And an interesting one of the conversations we've had quite a lot is one of those which says policing to have a national single learning platform so that policing can use one space, understand one model of learning delivery and have a consistent approach to it, which has caused quite a lot of conversation because everybody said, well, that's really difficult, we're not going to do that. We're not saying you have to, but we're saying it would be really helpful if you did. And so there is this broader space where there are these extra things which we say would be really helpful if you could do them at the same time, but they're not absolutely critical. So, what's the purpose of this model? So the purpose of this model is to try and explicitly link the space that operates at PCC and executive teams so that they have a model that they can look at and understand and have conversations amongst themselves about what a learning and development organisation should be thinking about in terms of its delivery space. It's also expressly designed to allow forced learning and development teams to think about how they're delivering learning and development effect across those three spaces, linked to the right levels of knowledge and capability from academia and best practice, and also to make sure they're delivering as mission and vision, etc. for their organisations. But it also talks to individuals within the organisation so that they understand where they fit within this triumvirate relationship between themselves as individual learners, their delivery into the organisation, but importantly their delivery out into those public spaces. And it's also designed so that they can have conversations between themselves using the same model as a point of commonality. So what is this model and what isn't it? So for those of you familiar with The Matrix, that is a clip, or it's a still from The Matrix, the film, and it's the point at which Neo and Morpheus are running around doing whatever it is Morpheus and Neo were doing in The Matrix, and the bad guys reset the system and the cat appears twice. And the bit of the film is all about déjà vu. And déjà vu in the film The Matrix spells danger. Because déjà vu means that the bad guys are coming. One of the things that this model is deliberately designed to do is to be anti-déjà vu. Because if we do not challenge ourselves beyond our comfortable spaces, it will feel all too familiar. And we won't stretch ourselves into new opportunities and new ways of thinking. What this model is designed to do is to do the opposite of déjà vu, which is vue jardin, of course, which has never seen this before. And the idea is that it is slightly challenging, slightly difficult to get hold of, and requires some active thinking on the part of users to think about what it does, what it means, and how to use it. And the reason for that is because we've all seen bits of work come out from various spaces where you can go, oh I can do that tick, I can do that tick, I've already done that tick, and you don't move your mental space into a new paradigm of thinking. And I think if there was one message out of today, it's shifting our thinking into a new paradigm of thinking about what learning and development is, how it delivers, etc. It's also designed not to be fixed to any starting point, not to be fixed to any particular capabilities or abilities to get there. It is designed to provide a vision of a space that you would want to get to in that future, but without telling you necessarily how to get there. And that quote from Morpheus and Neo is exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to open people's minds to other possibilities, and the tool and the model is designed to help people think through those challenges. But as it says, you have to want to make that jump. So, what's the implications of this approach? So I think if I were to describe a learning development space where organisational strategy leads to a decision and then learning and development is told about what the answer to that decision was and told to deliver it, is that a familiar space for people? Do people recognise that from learning and development? Okay. And that's the model we've got now. What we're saying is that implicit in this approach is a model where organisational strategy is absolutely linked to organisational goals, team goals and individual goals, and each of those is measured in turn against the organisational strategy. But also, importantly, they're all linked to learning and development strategy. So learning and development is the engine of delivery and change in an organisation. What's the gap in your performance? What do you need the organisation to be capable of and be capable of doing? Work out what the gap is, work out what the discrepancy is, and then put that back into the organisation. And that then links the purpose of measurement in the organisation back to an ability to think about whether you're measuring the right things to understand whether you're delivering the effect you're after and your learning and development feedback into that. But also importantly, we suggest that you want a direct link between your organisational strategy and your learning and development strategy. And certainly from the experience we've had in visiting forces, that is not universally the case. Learning and development strategies often sit in little spaces of their own. But if, as we say, this is the engine of delivery, if you do not have a very strong linkage between your organisational strategy and your learning and development strategy and delivery, it's not going to work. And then the model that we've produced is designed to link those three levels to allow a conversation between them about what spaces your activities being undertaken in, about how you're undertaking it, against what values, ethics and mission, and also against what outcomes in the public space. We've heard from CIPD this afternoon, and we've heard from the College of Policing as well. It's very interesting that although not explicitly designed to work with the colleges and CIPD's models, it works very well. Because the types of languages and the types of concepts we're playing with are very well aligned. And so we say that this is not incompatible with those approaches. In fact, in terms of the CIPD, we would say, actually, if you're being a CIPD professional, this is the tool that you apply to thinking about how you're using your tools and techniques from being a CIPD professional into thinking about what that future space of learning and development is. And in the college's case, nothing we're talking about here is incompatible. We continue to work with the college to make sure that those alignments are as close as we can have them. So, what's the point of all of this? The point of all of this is to provide you and policing with a conceptual model that allows you to look to that future of 2025, but without any certainty of what that landscape looks like. Because we're not telling you in a maturity matrix or a do step one, do step two, do step three model how to get there. Because we don't know where there is. We don't really understand individually where we are and where we're starting or what tools and techniques. But the idea is to provide you and colleagues in policing with a vision of what needs to happen in that space so that you can move towards it by best means that you can across the landscape that you encounter in your individual organisations. So, the last slide is just a summation of the challenge which has effectively been given to learning and development teams across the country. And hopefully you can have some sympathy with that position. So, ladies and gents, that's a very, very quick run through the destination map model. I know we're going to do some Q&A in a bit, but what I suggest is, I know that's a quick run through. For those of you who haven't seen this before or want more on it, my details are at the bottom of that slide. Don't hesitate to contact me or any of the other members of the team. I'm really happy to answer any further questions or provide extra explanation. And I know we're going to go into a provocation session now. So can I ask you to think about these two questions, ladies and gents? I'm assuming 15 minutes? For 15 minutes. So, in the same way that Kennedy set the challenge for the moon landings, let's imagine that we're in 2025. Let's imagine that the destination map is the model for policing. The question is, what do we need to do to get there? What do we need to change in terms of the political, strategic and tactical arenas within our organisations that we needed to change, shape, do, make, to create a space where the destination map is reality. And then the second one, if you have time, what do we need to make the world, what do we need to do now, not just in the future, to make that happen? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.